I get the whole running out of ideas trope has become a meme in and of itself on a lot of Hollow Knight channels, but I don't think I can understate just how starved some of us really are. Neither Silksong nor Elden Ring have release dates at the time this video is being made, and the only other AAA game for miles that's worth looking forward to is a remake of a game that was a little clunky, but already pretty damn good to begin with. And yeah, okay, I guess Cyberpunk is somewhere in there too, but at this rate I'll be dead before it's ever fully released, and you know damn well I'll be formally requesting Satya Nadella as one of my pallbearers just so Microsoft can let me down one last time. But it's not a complete shit show. See, I've realized that the longer time I have to wait, the more time I've been able to spend in the mirror, so to speak. The best part about being in the game for as long as I have is being able to dig up ancient videos from your past and being like, see guys, I have improved a little. Yeah, because it's been about 3 years, and if I'm being honest, it kind of blows my goddamn mind that people are still finding this video and subscribing to my channel because of it. If this video was your first impression of me and you're still with me currently, I genuinely thank you for staying with me, and I can only hope and pray to Gorb himself that since then your tastes have also improved. That said, I'm not gonna mince words. I've decided to revisit the points the old video attempts to make because, as someone that loves talking about the subject and this game so much, I really want to see this be done correctly. This is being redone because I am ultimately the only person that can ever be responsible for my own credibility. Not because I owe anyone a fucking favor. It's not like anyone in Hollow Nest ever did me any favors. But then again, I guess if Cornifer ever did take the liberty of actually completing any of his goddamn maps, then I guess there really wouldn't be a thrill behind charting the rest of it yourself. A coloring book wouldn't be nearly as appealing if it were sold to you with the shit already colored in. An important courtesy that isn't lost on Hollow Knight's navigation. You begin the journey in the King's Pass, an array of caverns that link themselves directly to the mouth of the kingdom, a small village known as Dirtmouth. Directly below the surface, you have the Middle Crossroads area, named appropriately because your knight can get to just about anywhere in the Upper Kingdom from here. You also have the tribes to the west in the Green Path, the cemetery to the east, and the Northern Crystal Mines. Down below that, you've got the gardens inhabited by the Mantis traders, the fungal wastes, the waterways of the kingdom's cities, and an obscure misty canyon that houses the kingdom's archive collection. On the lowermost level, you can discover the remnants of the Weaver tribes in the Deep Nest, the mysterious ancient basin, and the kingdom's edge, all the way to the edge of the kingdom. Wow, Rusty is so great at writing scripts. Thanks, I tried really hard. And it's all anchored steadily in place by the central hub of the kingdom, the City of Tears. Oh, and there's like a beehive somewhere. And although I rifled through all of those pretty quickly, don't expect the game to throw all of that at you at once like I did. Hollow Knight's navigation is extremely important because it remains in constant lockstep with how it conveys its atmosphere. Hollow Nest's fall from grace as a kingdom is more than just something you're told. It's something you feel when you unearth all of these biomes and find out for yourself just how massive this place is. That brooding depression wouldn't feel as thick had the game handed to you the entire map in grocery list format. This game is enormous, and I was pretty confused by that. I don't know, it looked like something you would pick up expecting it to be your weekend's time sink, only for it to slowly dawn on you that you've accidentally unpacked a Tolkien-sized can of bugs. But on the bright side, that means you're in perfect position to start exploring your relationship with the knight, because it doesn't know a goddamn thing about the kingdom either. The knight has no memory of the kingdom, and subsequently, when purchasing a map from Cornifer, it's never complete, and it's usually up to the knight to fill in the gaps of the kingdom as you explore. The more crannies and alleyways you uncover, the wider the knight's memory of the kingdom, and the more it's able to fill in. It's a nice little mechanic that's both contingent with the game's story and a means of incentivizing players to go just a room or two further ahead than you think you're able. And as wide open as the kingdom itself is, I don't feel like Hollow Knight ever makes the mistake of confusing the word exploration with the word lost. It's not a coincidence that both of these areas shown here can be traversed using the same ability, nor is it a coincidence that both ways just so happen to take you to the exact same area, and therefore to the very next tool the game expects you to need. It's still the same destination, but it makes makes it feel much more, I don't know, personal, I guess. The fact that you remembered that specific room where a normal jump wouldn't do the trick and returned to it later with the dash and are then rewarded by discovering an entirely new biome makes it feel like that discovery is all your own. It doesn't feel like the player is being led down a certain path from A to B and that's it. It feels like you actually found something. And at that moment, the fear of getting lost is no longer there because the game has made it to where discovering something new about the kingdom is just that thrilling. And once I made that discovery for myself, it sort of dawned on me why the game didn't want to just shove me in that direction. You're never truly helpless. Even when the city gate slams shut behind you and soft locks you into the City of Tears area, there are still ways to get back out. You can take the simple key from below the storerooms area, plunge down into the royal waterways, and head far left to where you find Cornifer and open up the passageway there. Do you remember dying to your first Mantis Lords fight and then getting bitched out by Quirrell telling you your nail isn't strong enough? Well, assuming you went straight to the nailsmith in the city and did exactly that, you want to take a guess where that waterway passage spits you out? Yep. Right at the ass end of the Mantis village, baby. See, it's all connected. And the whole point is, you don't have to do any of that. It's much easier and much more advised to go to the Soul Master and use Desolate Dive to move forward naturally. But if there were a note on someone's door just telling you how to get past all that, it wouldn't feel nearly as personal. As you pay attention to various street signs and markings and logos and such, you begin realizing they aren't there just to make the world look more complicated than it is. The signs are there to show you just how complicated the world really is. Being free to explore the biomes of the kingdom, the game divulges just enough information for you to never 100% truly feel like you don't know where you are. All the signs directing you to your next critical ability or to the nearest checkpoint or tram station is a means of giving you the confidence to continue on into uncharted territory, despite not always feeling like you have the resources to do so. If it just so happens that your knight is further away from a bench than usual, the signs and architecture and whatnot have great ways of communicating potential danger ahead in a way that doesn't feel like your leash is being tightened. If you're about to accidentally stumble into a boss encounter you aren't ready for instance, the game is probably going to let you know by abruptly cutting out the music as you enter the room or by making some slight change to the visuals of the background that sets it apart from the rest. Whatever the change may be, it's usually a big enough flag to signal to players 3 more steps forward and they're fixing to have their butts fucked by a walking volcano. But despite the courtesy warnings of the butt receiving the fuck in question, giving the player a heads up in this department isn't something that's too unique. And I feel like I'm going to be saying that a lot. Nothing the game ever puts on its platter is truly never before seen. The art of pre-boss battle suspense has been exercised by so many similar games already that doing it correctly has become more of an expectation, really. But there's something to be said here for not trying to reinvent the wheel. Probably the most clever means of navigation they came up with was their design choice in how the biomes are often bridged between one another. If you're close to exiting the crossroads, for instance, and you're about to head into the fungal wastes, there's likely going to be a small divot of space in between that shares characteristics of both biomes. Navigating through the space and towards the new area will likely yield the screen to color correct itself into the biome you're about to head into. The muted blues and grays of the crossroads, slowly transitioning into the acidic yellow glow of the wastes, or the nutrient-rich soil, bristling vines, and hidden sanctuaries that welcomed you into the green path, transitions into getting your legs blown off by surface-to-air jellyfish missiles that unmistakably personify the Fog Canyon. But the changes aren't always as discernible as an entire color palette swap. A lot of times, you can tell apart 2 different biomes from something a little more subtle, like the background elements, or even something like architecture. The City of Tears and the White Palace, for instance, are 2 of the more populated and civilized areas in the game, despite their architecture being made with 2 completely different approaches. All of the architecture in the City of Tears have cleaner edges and nicely rounded off surfaces to establish a sense of peace and welcome, while the sharper and more aggressive architecture in the White Palace is a key ingredient ingredient in making the player feel less like a citizen and more like a trespasser. A detail so unobtrusive and so internalized into the game that it took manually extracting the image files for me to even notice it. The symmetrical arrangement of civilized biomes like the palace can be directly contrasted to the architecture in more primeval biomes like the deep nest or the wastes. And I think sub-areas like the Mantis Village or the Weaver's Den are perfect examples of just how layered this architecture can get. The Mantis Village is a sub-area of the wastes, so the transition into said area is much softer. Instead of a full color change, the environment starts looking less organic and more intentional, I guess. Architecture, spikes, and buildings begin popping up in the background to communicate to the player that you're no longer walking around in some acidic no man's land. This is somebody's home. The mantises are extremely intelligent while having less access to the kingdom's resources, so the environment has to be built in a way that establishes the resourcefulness of the mantises without making things look too symmetrical, like you would see in a city, for instance. Head to the distant village in the westernmost corner of Deep Nest, and you'll kinda notice the same thing. Pretty much the entirety of Deep Nest is this ugly, jagged chasm in the armpit of the kingdom that's just bereft of what little civilization it used to have, at least until you get to this part here, where the architecture shows signs of becoming a little less organic. There's a reason why the very next room over contains a small village with a stag station. And if it sounds like I'm over-explaining this one little detail, it's because I am. It's because this shit is important, and the game does this all the time. You see examples of this practically fucking everywhere, and I wouldn't be nearly as gung-ho on driving that home if there weren't more than like 4 people appreciating it. Don't get me wrong, I'm certainly aware of how much this is starting to sound like an improvised Pepe Sylvia bit. I mean, given the length, I'm sure no one that clicked on this video would mind a deep dive or two, but the truth is, you can only break this stuff down so much until the presentation of it all just goes tits up, and your script just kinda devolves into a pretentious art student's shitty master thesis by complete accident. The way this game is built is really seamless. I guess that's why I find it so difficult to talk about one facet of the game without just naturally carrying the subject somewhere else. I can always afford to just revisit topics like this whenever relevant and give you my insanity in more proper doses. I could write a second script entirely about how the game's navigation and storytelling are all somehow linked in a way that affects the flow of gameplay and combat, but I'm barely 2.5 pages in and I can already feel the Adderall wearing off, so I guess I ought to make this shit quick. The game does a pretty great job managing your intake of new abilities, making sure you're just equipped enough to tackle whatever is an hour or two ahead of you while still being grossly underpowered for encounters much further in the future, which is something a lot of good games, especially in the Metroidvania territory, already have somewhat of a grasp on. But whereas many games tend to draw a hard line in the sand between impossible and, well, not impossible, Hollow Knight seems to compartmentalize the stages of your progress in 3 ways, where the not impossible side of the sand is broken down further into effortless and you might have to try a little. And since that can probably be condensed into a single academic term I'm carelessly glossing over, I'll just explain it this way. If a big jump or a high ledge or something is impossible or impeding progress, you won't have to walk a tightrope just to figure that out. If you reach a point in the kingdom where you can't go any further, the game is gonna make it immediately apparent to you, and shit, even then, there's still probably a way around if you test the walls enough. But again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. If there's a sign pointing to part of the game's architecture that reads, hey, fuck ass, you can do a sequence break by pogoing off this funny looking vase, that's going to be at the expense of the player's agency, and that discovery is no longer going to feel personal. That's part of Hollow Knight's appeal, I guess. Hollow Nest was already much bigger than I could have ever expected it to be, and everything else being relatively simple in comparison makes the kingdom feel that much more open. And I might be opening a can of worms that I don't want to by saying this next sentence, but that's the way Hollow Knight, and quite frankly Dark Souls in general, tackles combat. But the way Hollow Knight and Dark Souls games in general tackle combat is what's got a lot of people fucked up. Many people that exercise complaints about its combat tend to fall into 2 different ballparks. Either the combat is too hard and unforgiving and perhaps even unbalanced, or the combat feels uneventful and bland because it doesn't really offer anything new, despite how refined it is. And whereas I find myself tasting less rubber when I say the latter point out loud, I don't really think either conclusion judges the game by the right merits. It's not that the combat system is even simple, because once you start unlocking abilities and nail arts and charms and whatnot, the combat starts to get nuanced really quickly. But Hallownest providing to you the brooding and oppressive atmosphere it pulls off so well wouldn't be nearly as effective if the combat had the excitement and fanfare a lot of people criticized it early on for not having. A lot of the adversaries in the game are quite intelligently designed to dick you over. And that works because the game makes it abundantly clear to you from the word go that there's nothing really outstanding about your vessel. If you whipped out a katana that was longer than you were and started slicing up the traitor lord like he was cardboard henchman template C right before turning around and flashing your tits to the person playing while your anime hairstyle morphs into a fucking dragon, that wouldn't really fall that in line with how heavy and dark Hallownest was concepted to be. It's not hard because the combat is simple or even because you're under-equipped. It feels hard because the combat isn't built to make you feel like Dark Souls Superman at the end of every single encounter. You aren't Bill Kickass III storming in with a battle axe and biceps the size of the chair I'm sitting in. You're this lone wandering knight carrying a broken weapon with so little memory of the kingdom you were born in that every map you buy from Cornifer ends with you having to fill out half the goddamn thing anyways. And that's not me saying the game is unfair, but it is harsh. Kinda should be. It's harsh, but I never really got the impression that I wasn't given a fighting chance. Even against enemies you are flat out not prepared for. The mobility tools like the dash and the wall jump are two of the most rudimentary abilities in the game, and not just for exploration. You can theoretically have a +0 nail with no charms and still beat the game's final secret boss without getting hit. I've seen it happen. Not in YouTube videos, as in I've literally watched someone do it. Don't get me wrong, loading yourself out with Long Nail and Mark of Pride and turning the game into a Sephiroth roleplay does give you an edge, but the win state isn't single-handedly determined by these benefits. It's determined by the core abilities of the knight. And that's where I have to give Hollow Knight's charm system the most credit. Throughout Hallownest, you collect various power-ups, buffs, and enhancements in the form of trinkets called charms. These charms are often either survival power-ups that increase your health or make you more resilient, or they're an accent to an ability you already have, like extra spell damage and longer melee reach. This is why Shaman Stone has always been one of my favorite charms in the game, because it does kind of both in a way. It increases the damage of all your spells while also giving a pretty decent boost in size to your Vengeful Spirit ability. You also have smaller quality of life kind of charms like Gathering Swarm and Wayward Compass that are designed specifically for the player's convenience when exploring, charms like Dream Wielder and Nailmaster's Glory that significantly decrease the charge time on some of the knight's abilities, and charms like Heavy Blow, whose first, last, and only outstanding feature is a title that speaks for itself. Some charms have specific interactions with each other when used in a build together. These interactions can be mechanical, aesthetic, and sometimes even both. You're only capable of carrying a build that amounts to 3 notches in the beginning, but you can collect charm notches either from adventures or by buying them from a vendor. The more charms you've collected in the kingdom means the more charm notches she will sell to you, which sounds incredibly cheap and annoying at face value, but it actually isn't too big of a deal. Despite it being a necessity to some degree, it still feels fun just, you know, finding them. And I think that's because charms are given a reason to exist outside of just unlocking the ability to use them. Part of the fun of discovering a new charm is figuring out how its effects can be used against certain enemies or in certain environments. Even if you don't have the charm notches for a complete build that involves that charm, you still usually have enough space to at least test out how the charm works in tandem with others. There are also 40 of them, and despite that sounding like a lot, this kingdom is massive. So it's not like they're just lying on the ground waiting for a new owner. A lot of charms are hidden behind walls, secrets, or platforming challenges in a way that makes finding them feel just as engaging as actually using them. So even if you do end up loading the charm into your build a grand grand total of 0 times, you're still walking away feeling like you accomplished something. And the fact that this sort of thing being done in almost any other game would be reduced to the feeling of getting items on a shopping list, I think is a huge testament to just how fun they've made finding shit. Okay, I derailed myself somewhere, but my point is, a game's combat mechanics almost always involves more than just how you swing a sword, or nail in this case. It's never just been about power-ups and extra lives. It's about how dynamic the environments are, how certain enemies react to your attacks, and Hollow Knight extends a couple steps further and even puts thought into how and why a certain enemy even has the agency or sentience or skill to dodge what is called an attack. The Mantis Warriors, for instance, are one of the few tribes in the kingdom who haven't surrendered to the infection plaguing Hallownest, and as expected, their own AI and moveset is built in a way that makes them much more strategic and intentional. This makes sense, seeing as how the Mantis tribe has managed to stave off the infection and keep from being brainwashed by digesting too many clumps of rotten Sunny D. Probably the strongest bit of evidence for this is how most bosses the knight will face are hostile on sight, while fighting the Mantis Lords requires the player to manually trigger the event by challenging them up front. We see this in the Queen's Gardens as well, where some Mantis Warriors will attack you head-on, while others tend to hover from a distance and attack you with the use of projectiles. Fighting a group of Mantis Warriors, even when infected, will always feel organized and structured, but once the player takes time to learn their attack patterns, the way they organize themselves against you gets really predictable, and their largest strength becomes their most glaring weakness. Some smaller enemies with simpler AI don't always express clear signs of infection, so even though they still have their sentience, their size and shape as enemies are usually enough to indicate that they aren't capable of thinking too hard about something. It doesn't take a mathematician's IQ to look at an enemy like this and just kinda know you should feel very, very bad if it kills you. And if you've poked around in the Hunter's Journal, you should also know that being candid is definitely not something the game has a problem with. There are exceptions to these rules, of course, that do exist in the game. Platforming in the mines can kinda get really intense and convoluted, despite the player being expected to occasionally do combat with the Crystal Hunters. So in these instances, the phrase combat system not only refers to your tussle with earthworms or the rot candy mosquitoes, but also with the limited vision or extra acrobatics involved in doing so. A game's combat is only ever as simple or as complex as the environment it's in, and building the difficulty curve around the environments and the movements of the enemies you're fighting without ever needing to change the knight's core moveset is a stroke of brilliance that I think like 4 people are appreciating. And if you did stop playing Hollow Knight or try to write it off as a bad game because of its difficulty, then okay. I hate to sound condescending, but what else would you have expected? You're playing as a kitchen crumb-sized bug wearing a trash bag over its body, and your reaction to getting your ass kicked by a boss named the God Tamer is that of surprise? Seriously? This is not fucking Saints Row. There are plenty of feel-good, easy-mode time-seeing games out there that are begging for your attention if that's what you're into. That's not even me saying games have to be hard to be considered good, but I seriously have no idea who keeps trying to tell people that every single game has some inherent obligation or responsibility to account for everyone's tastes. And whoever insists on that being a rule obviously wasn't forced into playing Overwatch for almost 4 years as his main job. When you try to make a gameplay system that has something for everyone, you aren't making that game more accessible. You're just making it harder for people to criticize it without a biased opinion. And if you overtly dislike the game you're criticizing while admitting in the next paragraph you stopped at the crossroads because of how difficult it was, then I suggest getting in touch with the National Football League this September because it might be time for another draft. Probably one of the largest debates encircling the sphere of Hallownest is its merit as a particular type of game, a Soulslike, a descriptor of a subgenre of action games that are composed of, if not fundamentally rooted in Dark Souls-like elements. And I'd really like to cite the textbook I read that in, but it's been so long I don't even remember the name, and even if I did, the select people I'd be citing it for would still make up a reason to challenge it anyways, so fuck it. This has always been a sort of a touchy subject for the fan bases of both games, but I don't feel like the debate has ever been touchy because it's a complex topic to discuss or anything. If there's any reason people shy away from this conversation, it's largely because any Polygon staff writer that wrote about Dark Souls felt obligated to turn their review into this complicated and pedantic think piece about why games need to be accessible, because they watched one Mark Brown video and started taking themselves way too seriously. But the problem with this was any validity of the parallels one could have drawn between Hallownest and Lordran were more or less drowned out by critics that got their rocks off crying sif whenever a game's default difficulty climbed even slightly above the level of Go Fish. And like a World War I American soldier with trench foot, we've all been wired to fight back this PTSD-like shudder at the bare mention of a game being like Dark Souls in any capacity whatsoever. The comparisons between the two titles are certainly warranted, make no mistake, but I don't really think that's ever been the anchor of the discussion. It's not about how similar they look when standing beside each other, it's more about where. Both games drop you into a previously inhabited but worn down kingdom whose occupants were very derelict in their preservation of it. Both games use a mountain-steep difficulty not only as a reward system for overcoming impossibly challenging enemies, but also as a vehicle for their storytelling, which further explains and justifies why both games have a default difficulty setting that's perceived as unwelcoming and unfair despite there being no way to adjust it, or at least not in the options menu, I guess. And even then, when describing a game like Hollow Knight, I still think it's inappropriate to pin words like impossible to its combat. You wouldn't spend 2 hours getting the shit kicked out of you by an old senile dung beetle or a smiling bush if you weren't convinced there was at least some way to overcome it. Each encounter teaches you a specific behavior or set of skills the game thinks would serve you well later on, and you as the player are expected to take those new reflexes you've built up and serve it to the next guy in line. Mantis Lords teach you how to recognize attack patterns and take advantage of them. Soulmaster teaches you the value of knowing when to play defensively versus aggressively, and Gruzmother teaches you to suppress your emotions to the suffering of others by literally walking into a church and orphaning a family of unborn infants before wiping them out too. The fact that the Dung Defender can be Jack-in-the-Boxed outside of his shit pit with Desolate Dive, and the need to use the spell to break open the path to a bench are both not so subtle indications that the game prefers you kill the Soul Master prior. It's a progression that's just obvious enough to point you in the preferred direction without holding your hand and practically walking you there. I'm not gonna mince words here, it's actually pretty goddamn genius how the combat and the game mechanics have their own part to play in navigating you around. And if it feels like this review is kind of all over the place, that's only because it really is that fucking hard to write an analysis of the game that tightly transitions from one point to the next, because the game itself is that fucking seamless. There aren't that many instances I can think of where one facet of the game isn't lending itself to highlight another. The combat contributes to navigation, which then contributes to the game's storytelling, which is told in a pace that also contributes to navigation, and it's fuck my life, dude. I can definitely see where people can play this for 3.5 years without ever getting tired of it. And I'm not saying that just because I'm one of those people. And even if I was, what the fuck would you do about it? Cutting to the chase here is already a tall order because this video is shaping up to be a half-hour long on a good day. So if I spend another half hour on top of that discussing the full plot of the game, this video is gonna become a goddamn double feature by complete accident. So I'm gonna try not to do that. Additionally, there are already videos in full circulation that cover that exact topic. So I think I'm just gonna plead the fifth for my own sake and focus on how the story of Hallownest is told and not the story itself. The game's storytelling is done through its imagery just as often as it's done through its text, but almost none of it seems to stare you in the face from the jump. Thankfully, we've had games in the recent past that have shown us some stories are better experienced when the audience themselves is in charge of pulling back the curtain. Some of the exposition can be found by reading lore tablets dispersed through the kingdom that give you a general overview of the biome you're in, but a majority of what the game has to offer in story pretty much mirrors the FromSoft patented figure shit out yourself approach. It does start getting a little more overt the closer you get to the endgame, but only because it has to. And I guess that doesn't mean they couldn't have gotten away with hiding 100% of the plot, but it's not going to feel like you're working towards anything satisfying if at least some of the rising action isn't told to you explicitly. Hollow Nest is a decrepit kingdom with decrepit residents trapped in the claws of a relentless mind-controlling virus, as they wrestle with the reality that the only thing worth looking forward to at this point is a painless death. And the game does a great job communicating that up front by using a constantly looming music score designed to make you feel empty and alone, and making every single NPC look like the after-school drawings of a 5th grader with learned helplessness and an abusive stepfather named Todd. As the knight, you spend your time slowly untying the knots of the kingdom and finding out why it met with the fate that it did, leading you to the discovery of a dark secret having to do with the creation of both you and about 10,000 other yous discarded thoughtlessly into the Pale King's holy trash bin. And if you've made it to this part of the video, I'm assuming you've 1. Completed the game with this ending because you 2. Took the time to read the giant bold text spoiler warning that I hopefully remembered to put at the beginning. The TLDR of it is simply, you suck. You suck and the Pale King thinks you suck. He thinks you suck and he casted you down into the pit of things that suck so that you could see that you suck. And there are a lot of goddamn things down there that really fucking suck, and you're one of them. But you don't suck that bad because the Pale King chose a thing that he thought was great, but actually it sucked. And the reason why this is so important is because part of your knight's journey of self-actualization, or whatever, requires going through this area, a royal palace long abandoned by its parliament. And you, a thing previously thought by the kingdom to have sucked, are infiltrating it with your mind's eye, or something. The palace technically only exists in a dream, but unfortunately no one ever turned off all the courtyard security systems before jumping ship, so they've continued to be active, likely thanks to all the electricity being generated from the Pale King spinning in his grave so goddamn fast. A large part of the story is told through dialogue prompts with NPCs, vendors, and what little life the kingdom has left crawling around in it. But an equally large part of its world building is communicated to you through its imagery and its art. All the key items have small descriptions attached to them that explicitly tell you where the item should be used, but if you're an independent thinker that can't be fucked with reading words, there's usually something in the imagery of the item that can nudge you in the right direction. It took me an embarrassingly long amount of time for me to make the connection that the face embossed onto the center of the elegant key actually bears likeness to the Soul Twisters in the Soul Sanctum, not to mention the carved head right above the door frame that pretty much all but outright confirms you're supposed to use the key here. This is repeated with the handle end of the shopkeeper's key resembling Sly, and also in some of the charms themselves. If you look closely, most of the soul-related charms feature this sort of swirling pattern that reference the snail shamans and their affinity for soul. Another way the game communicates its story is by utilizing different leitmotifs in its musical score. It took me pretty long to catch on to the fact that the somber musical theme of the Pale King actually shares the same leitmotif as Hornet's main battle theme, which makes sense considering Hornet is the Pale King's daughter. The same leitmotif is also used each time the knight fights another vessel, specifically the Broken Vessel, Hollow Knight, and Pure Vessel fights. These themes all share one signature characteristic, being that it's the melody of the game's own main menu theme. This is actually because the knight is fighting one of its own kind. The Pure Vessel's theme has really long and drawn-out melodies that make the fight feel larger and much more high stakes than the others, while the Broken Vessel's theme is accompanied with really short, stabby, staccato notes to represent the encroaching infection. Moreover, the Sealed Vessel theme is sad as shit to match the equally sad as shit lore behind the game's standard ending. If I'm being real here, whether or not I'd recommend this game is a question you can probably answer yourself by just looking at my upload history. But it isn't the hand-drawn art style or the pared-down gameplay that made this game the most enjoyable and satisfying adventure I've had in years. If I'm being honest, it's not even the way the game overlaps all of its facets to create this holistic and unified experience that I'm just now learning does not translate well into script writing. I've spent almost 4 years with this game because every single run somehow manages to feel just slightly different from the run you completed last time. It's a game where every discovery, every sequence break, every little charm or ability you pick up, and every path you travel feels wholly exclusive to you as a player. When you're told to just drop all of your hard-earned money into a fountain for no explicit reason, and you finally overcome your fear of your wallet being hard reset and decide to just go for it, the riches you reap from that sacrifice is so memorable in the most whimsical way. And this only makes the endgame that much more delightful when you open up your map of the kingdom and reflect on all the places you've been and all the people you've talked to, and it's just... I guess I should also admit that this game did not find me in a particularly great spot. At the end of 2016, I was dealing with the social burden of transferring schools and saying goodbyes to friends that, at the time, I was under the impression I would be with forever. And as I was craving escapism and beginning to spiral downward into one of the worst headspaces I can ever recall being in, I randomly logged onto Steam one day and saw this cool upcoming release called Hollow Knight. I only ever saw around 30 seconds of the gameplay trailer before deciding to buy it, because for whatever reason I was just entranced by this little bug-sized crusader and I wanted to know more about the adventure. I chunked out maybe 4 or 5 hours to spend with the game, naively expecting to start and finish it in the same setting, descending down elevator shafts to the capital city and seeing the memorial fountain for the very first time, trying to wall jump on the resting ground platforms and never getting it quite right, or trying to clear the entire height of the abyss in one desolate dive. These are memories I've had for forever, it seems. About 4 years and over 900 hours of playtime later, I've become more engaged with this game's community than I ever thought was emotionally possible for me. I've made so many different friends, and I've chatted with you in so many Discord servers, I've collabed, I've shared scripts and ideas, I've invaded your streams, I've pulled embarrassingly long all-nighters with some of you just talking for hours about how irreparably fucked this platform is. I've laughed, I've shitposted, and I've even grieved with a few of you. I was always told that anything or anyone you lose in life will eventually circle its way back to you in another form, and that feeling lost and hopelessly encumbered by the ever-looming thoughts of what could have been is what makes that journey so personal. Because if you're never lost, then you can never experience the uniquely refreshing retribution of getting yourself back on the right track. And you'll never be able to broaden your circle with new challenges and experiences and friends. And even when some of those friends don't stick around for as long as you want them to. And when Hollow Knight creates these divergent labyrinthian pathways with diverse environments that overlap and crisscross themselves thousands of different ways while still leading the player to the intended destination somehow, just the scale of it all is almost too much to take in. And I don't feel anxiety from getting lost on my way there anymore. Because I know if I just have patience and stay the course, I'm going to end up exactly where I need to be.